Let's begin our intro into CSS. When we talk about structure versus presentation, structure is HTML, like we covered in the HTML section, and presentation is CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. CSS is a language that allows you to change the appearance of elements on the page, the size, style, color of text, background colors, border styles, and even the position of the elements on the page. HTML is for structure, again, while CSS is for presentation. The basics of CSS are pretty simple. Style sheets are made up of rules that control the styling and positioning of HTML elements. Each rule is made up of selectors, which are used to target HTML elements and declarations, which contain properties and values that the browser then uses to style the element. CSS3 is the latest evolution of the Cascading Style Sheets language and aims at extending CSS 2.1. It brings a lot of long-awaited novelties like rounded corners, shadows, gradients, transitions or animations, as well as new layouts like multi-columns, flexible box, or grid layouts. CSS styles are made up of two parts, the selector and the declaration. The selector here, P, which is for paragraph, tells the browser which element or elements in the document to style. Using this selector, all paragraphs within a style document will be formatted. While this element selector is pretty simple, selectors can be very complex depending upon which elements on the page you're trying to target. Selectors can be grouped together or even combined to allow for more precise element targeting. The declaration, which is enclosed in these curly braces, uses the formatting instructions for the style. Here are the two rules, one telling the browser which font to use, and another defining the size of the font. The rules themselves are made up of two parts, the property and the value. These are separated by colons and use a semicolon to tell the browser to stop evaluating and move on to the next rule. While this syntax is simple, you will need to learn the myriad of selectors and selector combinations which make it possible to exercise a greater amount of control over page elements. You'll also need to learn the various properties you can set for each of the elements and the values that are allowed for that property. For the most part, the use of whitespace doesn't matter, although there are some additional syntax rules to learn. For the most part, this is as complicated as CSS gets. There is more than one way to add a cascading style sheet, CSS, to your HTML document. We'll cover the advantages and disadvantages of the four main methods. First is linking to a separate CSS file. This is the most common method of attaching CSS rules to an HTML document. With this method, all of your style rules are contained in a single text file that is saved with the .css extension. This file is saved on your server and you link to it directly from each HTML file. The major advantage of this method is if you need to make a style change across your whole website, then you only need to make the change once in your single CSS file. The second method is by embedding CSS into the HTML. You can embed CSS rules directly into any HTML page. To do this, you need to add style tags underneath your opening head tag of the HTML document. All of your CSS rules go between the two style tags. A disadvantage to this approach is the styles must be downloaded every time someone visits the page, and this can cause a slightly slower browsing experience. Several advantages are that the CSS is part of the HTML document. The whole page exists as just one file, and this can be useful if you are sending the page to someone via email or if it will be used as a template. Another advantage of using this method is with dynamic content. If you're using a database to generate the page, you can also generate dynamic styles at the same time. A third method is through adding inline CSS to HTML tags. Style rules can also be added directly to any HTML element. To do this, you simply add a style parameter to the element and enter your style rules as the value. There is an example in your notes for Unit 2, Intro to CSS. This is not a good method to use because it will bloat your HTML and make website maintenance a pain. However, it can be useful in some situations. One example could be if you're using a system where you don't have access to the CSS file, simply add your CSS style rules directly to the elements instead. This method I would use sparingly, of course, like if you were working inside of another interface and you wanted to add style tags like we mentioned, but you don't have access to the CSS file. If you were to do this to your own website, then that meant that anytime someone said, okay, I want to change that color, you would have to go to every element and adjust that color. Our fourth and final method is through importing a CSS file from within CSS. This is another interesting way to add CSS to HTML page. It's with the import rule. This lets us use an attached CSS file from within CSS itself. Even the most complex style sheets start out with a single rule. When you're working on a particularly massive and complex website, over time your style sheets will inevitably start to reflect the site's size and complexity. And even if you employ every trick for organizing your CSS in the book, you might find that the sheer size of the file is simply overwhelming. At that point, you might want to consider splitting your style sheets up into several smaller CSS files. That's when the import rule can come in quite handy. Inside of your notes for Unit 2, you'll see how the CSS import rule is utilized within the HTML document. Your imports must come before all other content in your CSS, and I mean all of your content. Even putting comments before the import tag will cause your imports to fail, so be sure to do your imports before you do anything else. The following is a list of things you should consider as you're looking to move forward into learning CSS. Learn as much as you can about selectors. This is the first thing you should do. Learn which properties can be set for each type of element and which values are accepted for specific properties. Focus on how you should implement CSS within your HTML pages. And also learn the 3 core rendering principles of CSS: specificity, inherence, and the cascade. And another great way to learn CSS syntax is to examine CSS found on other sites. There are some differences between how browsers render specific properties, and it's really important that you have a general idea of what is supported and how rendering might differ from browser to browser. Occasionally, you can create fallbacks or workarounds for browsers or simply design around the browser's differences. If you refer back to your notes, the intro to CSS, you'll see some links I provided for further research.